Everyone knows what Harry Potter is. It's the best-selling book series of all time with over 450 million copies sold. And it's not hard to see the appeal of it. It's all about a kid who gets to leave behind his shitty, mundane life and go hang out in a magical world where he's one of the most important, coolest, best guys ever, and he gets to fight Wizard Hitler with his friends. It's a good story that can be enjoyed by both kids and adults. I think everyone can agree with me there. The series is made using a formula, one which checks off just about every box necessary to make a nigh-perfect kid's story. It offers escapism and wonder while still being able to deal with real-world issues and themes of growing up. The mass appeal pushes all the right buttons to make it the phenomenon that it is. I think everyone can agree with me there, too. But here's where I might ruffle some feathers. Percy Jackson and the Olympians, as well as all its spin-offs, take the Harry Potter formula, which was already great for kids' stories, and perfect it. Consider for a minute the similarities between the two. A young boy grows up as an outcast with a shitty home life. Then one day he discovers that there's a hidden magical world out there that he's a part of. Not only that, but by entering that world he gets to leave his shitty home life and be a very powerful, important person. Then a villain from the past that threatens both the regular and magical worlds comes back and the young boy has to lead the fight against him. The fight takes place over the course of years and the main cast all grows and matures as the series goes on, which causes some darker themes to arise. As much as the characters might try to say that the world is dangerous, there's an obvious wish fulfillment aspect to just about everything that makes you want to be a part of it. Oh yeah, and the protagonist is the subject of a very important prophecy. Now obviously Harry Potter didn't invent this formula. The Chronicles of Narnia did the same thing back in 1950. However, Harry Potter leaned hard into the wish fulfillment aspect by diving into the setting much deeper than Narnia did. While Narnia had more of a whimsical fairy tale feeling, Harry Potter's world tried to make it feel like it could actually exist. I don't think I need to explain the plot of Harry Potter to anyone, but I will briefly go over Percy Jackson here. Major spoilers ahead. Percy Jackson is a 12-year-old kid with ADHD and dyslexia who has gotten kicked out of every school he's ever attended due to his various behavior issues. He's raised by his mother, a woman named Sally, and his verbally abusive stepfather, Gabe. His father supposedly died before he was born. One day, during a field trip, one of Percy's teachers is alone with him and turns into a harpy, a creature from Greek mythology. She attacks him and demands to know where he's taken something, but Percy has no clue what she's talking about. He receives a sword from another teacher and kills her. Weeks later, school lets out for the summer and he goes out to a cabin for vacation with his mother. The first night there, they get attacked by a minotaur. During the fighting, Percy's mother is apparently killed before he rips off the minotaur's horn and stabs it with it. It's a really badass scene. He finds his way to a nearby summer camp, called Camp Half-Blood, filled with more Greek mythological monsters and other kids. It turns out Percy is a demigod. His mother was mortal, but his father was a god. They just don't know which one. Percy stays at camp for a few weeks, during which he befriends another demigod named Annabeth, a girl about his age who's much smarter and more knowledgeable about the magical world than he is. Wait, what's that picture of Hermione doing there? After a fight with a hellhound, Poseidon, the god of the ocean, officially claims Percy as his son. This is a big deal because the big three gods, Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades, all made a pact decades earlier to not father any more demigod children. It turns out that Zeus's Master Lightning Bolt was recently stolen, and Poseidon is the prime suspect, which means that now Percy is a suspect too. To prevent an Olympian civil war, Percy is sent on a quest to the underworld to try and retrieve the bolt from Hades, who they think is the real thief. Before the quest, he's gifted with a sword and a pair of flying shoes from another camper named Luke. Percy takes his friends, one of whom is a goofy, well-meaning boy, and the other is a girl much smarter than both of them, on a series of adventures across the United States before they reach the underworld. This is similar to most old Greek myths, where the heroes would go off to accomplish something and then get sidetracked a dozen times before reaching their destination. On one of those side quests, they do a favor for Ares, the god of war, and he gives them a backpack full of supplies as recompense. When they reach the underworld, Percy's flying shoes attempt to drag him off to Tartarus, the deepest part of the underworld. When they meet Hades, he denies taking the bolt, revealing that his Helm of Darkness was stolen too. He tells Percy that he'll return his mother, who he's kept as a hostage, if he gives him the Master Bolt. The bolt suddenly appears in the backpack that Ares gave them, and they flee the underworld. Percy manages to defeat Ares in a duel, and the god returns the helm to Hades. Percy gives the bolt back to Zeus, meets Poseidon for the first time, averts a war, and gets his mother returned home. Everything seems great until he goes back to camp and gets attacked by Luke in the woods. Luke reveals that he was the real thief and that he was working on the orders of Kronos, the father of Zeus who was cast into Tartarus thousands of years earlier. Percy survives and Luke runs off to continue his plan to overthrow the Olympians. Despite having the option to stay at Camp Half-Blood year-round, Percy decides to return home with his mom until the next summer, and that's the end of the first book. The next 4 books in the series deal with the struggle between the gods and the returning Titans led by Kronos. If you've never read Percy Jackson but you know about Harry Potter, the similarities are pretty clear to see, but both the execution of the formulaic parts and the few differences elevate it above Harry Potter. One of the things that helped propel Harry Potter to the ridiculous level of success that it enjoyed was the fact that the books grew up with the readers. The first one had a couple of dark aspects, but was overall lighthearted. Percy Jackson starts off with the protagonist's mother being killed and him being forced to go on a quest to prevent war between literal gods. It's not overly violent or exploitative, it just treats kids as mature enough to handle some darker themes. In fact, at the end of the first book, Percy sends his mother Medusa's severed head, which she uses to turn his stepfather into stone and then sell him to an art collector. That's... holy shit. Imagine if Harry set his Uncle Vernon on fire and sold his ashes to a potion maker. You'd have a different view of the series after that, but you wouldn't really disagree with his actions because he was an abusive pile of garbage. In both cases, things get darker as time goes on, and in both cases, it's successful. Percy Jackson just starts in a darker spot, which made it more appealing to kids like me who liked to think that we were edgy, or kids that were just looking for something different. At the end of The Lightning Thief, Percy learns that an evil force from the past is coming back to destroy both the magical world and the mortal one. The rest of the books all deal with smaller one-off adventures that tie into the fight against that force. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone ends in pretty much the same way, and all the following books also have smaller adventures that tie into the fight against Voldemort. However, it's not immediately obvious that that's what's going on at first. The Chamber of Secrets is all about trying to figure out what's been going on at Hogwarts until the very end when it's revealed that Voldemort is behind everything. The Prisoner of Azkaban is all about a new villain who they think is out to kill Harry until the end when it's revealed that Voldemort is involved. Then Goblet of Fire is all about Harry trying to win the Triwizard Tournament until it turns out that Voldemort is again involved. Now let's compare it to Percy Jackson. In The Sea of Monsters, the tree that protects Camp Half-Blood from monsters is poisoned and he has to go on a quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece to heal it. But Luke and the forces of Kronos are going after it too, hoping to use it to resurrect him. Then, in The Titan's Curse, Kronos kidnaps the goddess Artemis and Percy and company go to rescue her. In both cases, it's immediately obvious that this is all part of something larger, that this isn't just a small quest, and that gives the entire series a more epic tone than Harry Potter, which had to essentially start from scratch every time. Even in the later books, it wasn't always clear-cut how the smaller conflicts tied into the bigger ones. Admittedly, this is a personal preference. I'm a bigger fan of large, overarching stories than bad guys of the week that are fought by the same character cast. And as much as I love the adventures of Harry and company, the early books did give off that feel when I was a kid. The final books in both series has a giant final battle between the forces of good and evil, but they're done in different ways. The Last Olympian dedicates the majority of the page count to a massive siege of Manhattan. The demigods of Camp Half-Blood have to prevent Kronos and his army from reaching the entrance to Olympus in the Empire State Building, all the while being slowly pushed back. The sheer scale of the battle is impressive, complete with dragons the size of buildings and gigantic armies of monsters. It's something I haven't seen replicated outside of epic fantasy. The only issue I have with it, and this is a serious nitpick, is that Manhattan hasn't been a major setting of the story up until this point. It's Percy's home, and we're a little concerned about the mortal population of the city being hurt, but as readers, we don't have much connection to it. Imagine if the final battle against Voldemort took place at Privet Drive. It would be kind of odd. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, on the other hand, is a much longer book that has a lot of other stuff going on before the battle begins. Not that that's a bad thing. The hunt for the Hallows is a fun bit of detective/heist work that allows the readers to see how the villain is taking over the magical world from a distance, as well as force the main cast to be outside of the safe zone that was Hogwarts. And since we've spent 6 books almost entirely at Hogwarts with all the people defending it, we have a stronger connection to the battlefield. And it still has all the same giant armies of monsters and magic that we love to see in a climax. But at the same time, the outcome of the battle doesn't have much to do with whether or not Harry and his allies win. All he has to do is destroy the last few Horcruxes to make Voldemort vulnerable, then kill him. After that, his whole army of wizard Nazis is leaderless, and so they scurry back to the shadows. In Percy Jackson, if they somehow managed to kill Kronos before the final battle ended, they still would have had several Titans to deal with, and the legions of monsters that they commanded. There was no easy way out for them, and so for that reason the Battle of Manhattan is better than the Battle of Hogwarts, even though they're following the same formula. But then, don't all epic final battles follow a similar formula? And you can't talk about either of these series without talking about the prophecies. As a rule, I dislike prophecies in fiction since they're usually done in such a way that they give away the story. And in Harry Potter's case, the prophecy came in 2/3 through the story and didn't add much other than hammering home the fact that Harry was super important. In Percy Jackson's case, though, I really like it. For starters, prophecies were an integral part of old Greek myths, and you couldn't tell a story based on them without including one. And for another, every prophecy in the books is done in a way where you think you know what they mean right up until the end when you realize that you were overlooking something obvious. For example, in the first book there's a line in the prophecy that says Percy will be betrayed by the one who calls him a friend. So for most of the quest he's paranoid that Annabeth or Grover will betray him, but it never comes true, and so he and the reader start to think that the prophecy was just wrong. Then at the end, the traitor turns out to be Luke. And then there's the main prophecy about Percy saving Olympus. It doesn't actually say that he's the subject of it, there are several other possible candidates until the very end. And it doesn't say that he'll save Olympus either, it says that he'll make a choice that will either save or destroy Olympus. That choice turns out to be giving Luke a knife that he uses to kill Kronos. Up until the last minute, we don't know exactly what the prophecy is talking about, but in retrospect, it makes perfect sense. The prophecy in this case adds new dimensions to the story rather than just telling us what'll happen up front in purple prose, or not adding anything in Harry Potter's case. I've already touched upon how the main trio in both cases are cut from similar cloth, and I have few complaints there. There are enough differences between Grover and Annabeth and Ron and Hermione to keep them from seeming like copies. The differences between the two leads are starker, though. The most immediate difference between the two is that Percy isn't an orphan. Both of his parents are alive and well, he just has a distant and uncomfortable relationship with his dad. That's something that way more kids can relate to. More of us had difficult relationships with our parents than no relationship, and almost none of us were stuck with cartoonishly evil guardians. Percy's mother has an actual personality and life beyond her son, too. She fell in love with Poseidon, but she knew he would dominate her life if she stayed with him. And after she leaves her husband, she goes back to college, gets a new job, marries a new husband, and eventually has another kid who isn't a demigod. The parent has an actual character arc. Holy shit! Do you have any idea how rare that is in kids' books? Percy also has ADHD and dyslexia that cause him problems in school, both before and after the story begins. I don't have a learning disability, but if I did, it would probably have been great to see a character like me work past his issues and become a hero. It would have let me know that my frustrations and struggles didn't mean I was worthless. Harry is, for the most part, a normal kid that got thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Percy is a very troubled kid who overcomes a lot in order to reach the same position. And while they both form romances with one of their friends, Percy's is still not great, but it's a little better than Harry and Ginny. There's plenty of time devoted to him and Annabeth becoming friends, so it makes sense that they'd move on to something more when they're older, but they're also cousins. His father is Poseidon and her mother is Athena, who is Poseidon's niece. If they just ignored that, it wouldn't have been so bad, but the last book actually takes time to point out that they aren't related because gods don't have DNA, which means that it's totally okay for demigods to date other demigods. I know that everyone in Greek mythology is related to everyone else, but ew. I also think that the setting of Percy Jackson is better than Harry Potter's. Now, before you get mad, I think that Hogwarts is the pinnacle of a wondrous magical place that we'd all love to go explore. But it's also very disconnected from the Muggle world. There are various ways that the wizards hide their existence from Muggles, and other than that, they keep to themselves. Percy and various other mythological figures have to hide their existence, but they still influence the mortal world and are influenced by it. The Bermuda Triangle is actually the Sea of Monsters, guarded by Scylla and Charybdis. Every time a Hydra's head is cut off, a donut shop opens somewhere. The Lotus Eaters run a hotel in Las Vegas where you can lose track of time and get stuck for decades. The mythological world is influenced by and profits from the mortal one. Not only that, Percy lives the majority of his life in the mortal world, dealing with normal problems like high school. This all comes together to remind us that when we're done with our escapism, we still need to return to the real world eventually. Both series deal with that idea, but Percy Jackson focuses on the mortal world enough that we don't forget about its existence. In Harry's case, it's easy to forget about the world outside Hogwarts, so I'd say that the setting isn't as good as it could be. And it's not just surface stuff that these two series have in common. Both of them have pretty similar themes. The most obvious in Harry Potter is that racism and classism are bad. And that's fine, but the more noteworthy one is that in times of crisis, the institutions we rely on often fail and we have to solve society's problems ourselves. In almost every book, there's a point where Harry goes off to try and deal with whatever evil is amuck, but he gets in trouble for it because he's breaking the rules. The laws and institutions of the magical world restrict Harry's attempts to improve the magical world. In the end, the Ministry of Magic is unable to even protect itself from being taken over by Voldemort and his wizard Nazis, which left the job of fighting against evil to a paramilitary group of good wizards who had little to do with the Ministry. And after the war is over, that same paramilitary went on to reform and improve the Ministry, aka the government. This is a much more poignant and, dare I say, relevant message to send. Percy Jackson deals with a similar theme, but in a less satisfying way. Many of the Olympian gods refuse to believe that Kronos is returning at first, and once they do accept that he's back, they're often too caught up in their own petty concerns to actually do anything of substance. Most of the work is left to demigods. A substantial part of Kronos' army is made up of demigods disaffected by the way the Olympians run things. They feel that if the Titans take back over, then they won't be forced to constantly fight the monsters that are always coming after them. It's not hard to see where they're coming from here. They're angry with the status quo, aka the Olympians, aka the government. The forces of Olympus only manage to defeat Kronos when the gods finally decide to work together and Kronos' lieutenant has a change of heart. And Percy does convince the Olympians to reform some of their laws in order to try and prevent another war, so there's acknowledgement that these issues exist and some progress is made towards fixing them. In both cases, the conflict is caused and or exacerbated by failures of institutions that are ostensibly there to protect and manage the magical worlds. Both series promote the idea that the world is imperfect, and that defeating evil involves not just fighting bad guys, but fixing the flaws in the society that gave rise to the bad guys. It's a smart message, it's just better in Harry Potter's case because it gets more focus. However, Rick Riordan tackles this from a different angle in the sequel series, The Heroes of Olympus. In that one, it's revealed that the Greek and Roman gods exist together, or rather that they exist as different aspects of the same gods. But the Greek and Roman demigods spend most of their time fighting each other, which literally paralyzes the gods. Believe me, it's confusing in the books too. No one can deal with the real threat because they're too busy fighting themselves. The instant they make up, the fight is over. This series also deals with institutional failure, but it puts some of the blame on the demigods themselves. Sort of. Most of the fighting comes from an attack on the Romans by a Greek ship, but the ship was under the control of the bad guys at the time, so really it's all based on a false flag. There's almost a good message about civic responsibility and needing to keep an eye on those with power, but it falls a bit flat. Still, I have to give credit for at least putting the idea out there. If someone ever comes along and writes something similar to Rick Riordan, but is more coherent in its portrayal of big ideas, then it really would be perfect. But that's not the end. There's 2 spin-offs called The Kane Chronicles and Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard that deal with Egyptian and Norse mythology respectively. It's confirmed that these all take place in the same world. Magnus Chase is even Annabeth's cousin on her father's side. Which makes me wonder, are there other gods out there? Is the Abrahamic god real too? There's a Muslim character in the Magnus Chase series, and a brief reference to Jesus from Dionysus.
It was one transgression, one, with a naiad for the sake of Olympus. How was I to know that Zeus had a thing for her, or that he could hold a grudge for so long? You know, the Christians have a guy who can do this trick in reverse. Now that's a god.
Admittedly, that was in the movie, which isn't canon, but it's an interesting question to consider. A world where all gods from all mythologies exist side by side but leave each other and the mortal world alone is a fascinating idea, one that I don't think has been explored enough. But when you consider that the world has been saved at least 4 times now by emotionally unstable teenagers, well, I just hope none of them ever have to fight Nyarlathotep. I don't care if I mispronounce that name, it's supposed to be incomprehensible to human minds. I won't go into much detail about the spin-offs because they kind of do the same thing. That's not bad, they all do it very well. And like I said, they've been following this same formula from the beginning, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I just wanted to bring up the fact that there's an expanded universe here, and that's really cool. Rick Riordan has taken the formula for making a successful children's fantasy and perfected it, and he's become one of the most prominent authors in the world for his trouble. While I love things like Harry Potter and Narnia, and think they're great to get kids into reading, it would be foolish to claim that modern books can't use the same ideas and make something even better. That's how all art works, by absorbing various influences and combining them in new ways. The point of this wasn't to show off how much better I think Percy Jackson is than Harry Potter, it's to show how even though they're structurally almost identical, and that structure is currently the best formula for a kid's story, they have some significant differences that set them apart. I don't like cliches, but The devil is in the details. So in the future, if you hear someone criticize a piece of media for being derivative, look into what they're talking about more closely. Even if the broad strokes are the same, the themes beneath them and the small details can differ wildly enough that at first glance you wouldn't even know how similar they are. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything is derived from something else, and that doesn't matter at all. I'd like to thank Des Brennan, Christopher Hawkins, Joseph Pendergraft, and all my other patrons for making this possible. Please consider checking out my page and donating. And if you can't do that, then drop a like and a subscribe before the never-ending tsunami of content on YouTube swallows me whole.